Our second scripture today comes from the first letter of Peter, chapter 2, verses 2 through 10. Like newborn infants long for the pure spiritual milk, so that by it you may grow into salvation. Indeed, if you have tasted that the Lord is good. Come to him, a living stone, though rejected by mortals, yet chosen and precious in God's sight. And like living stones, let yourselves be built into a spiritual house, to be a holy priesthood, to offer spiritual sacrifices acceptable to God through Jesus Christ. For it stands in Scripture, "See, I am laying in Zion a stone, a cornerstone, chosen and precious, and whoever believes in him will not be put to shame." To you then who believe, he is precious, but for those who do not believe, the stone that the builders rejected has become the very head of the corner, and a stone that makes them stumble and a rock that makes them fall. They stumble because they disobey the word as they were destined to do. But you are a chosen race, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, God's own people, in order that you may proclaim the mighty acts of him who called you out of darkness into his marvelous light. Once you were not a people, but now you are God's people. Once you had not received mercy, but now you have received mercy. Construction is a fascinating thing, and especially the ways that it differs in one place to another. I remember one of our first trips to Orange County. You still lived back east at that point in time, and we were driving around in Orange County, and I realized I didn't know what anything was. Because all of the architectural cues that told me this building is a store, this building is an apartment building, this building is a church, they were all different. And I didn't know what I was looking for. And of course, some of those things make sense. I remember too, when I had my first aha, why they make walls out of paper in Japan. There they are, located right on the Ring of Fire, and you certainly would want a paper wall to fall on you a lot more than a stone one, wouldn't you? And of course, why adobe construction fits in the desert, and stick construction works a lot better in places where you have big forests. Well, where I grew up, there was a lot of stone buildings. But you didn't use stone for just ordinary buildings very often. Didn't build houses out of stone in the Northeast very much. If you did, it was only because you were trying to be pretentious and show everybody that you had a stone house instead of one that was made out of brick or wood. Because stone in its solidity communicated something permanent, something with real gravitas. And so, courthouses were made of stone. Cathedrals were made of stone. In both Pittsburgh and Philadelphia, even prisons were made of stone. It told you something about the permanence of the structure. Now, the Emmanuel Baptist Church, where we were in Albany, New York, was a wonderful stone building, and the stone was fascinating. It was Onondaga limestone, which is limestone that was formed when the central New York was under an ocean. And it was sediment that fell there and collected there and then was pressed together into stone. And so this building was completely full of fossils. You could count them. Well, you couldn't count them. Even on one stone, there were so many of them that were visible. Every place you looked, all of these little tiny sea creatures. by the thousands and thousands and thousands. There was even a well-known sermon from one of the previous pastors of that church called Fossils in the Church. Yes, indeed. But I would stand outside that building sometimes and look at it and just think about that construction time. There was a tower on the front southwestern corner of the building that stood over 125 feet tall. Imagine how much weight was on those stones that were at the bottom of that wall. 125 foot of Onondaga limestone sitting on top of it. It was massive. And you had to know, as soon as you looked at it, that when those pieces of stone were chosen and cut, that was taken very, very seriously. Because if one of those stones had failed, it would have been an ugly, ugly thing on an inner city street to have that much rock falling from the sky. And I would imagine, as they were constructing that building, those masons standing there and looking at that piece of stone, and I don't know if they hit it with their hammer or what they did, because I don't know how that stuff works, but I'm sure that there were pieces of stone that they set aside and said, no, this one's going to go higher up. We're not going to put this down here. It's not going to take the weight. And then there were others that they looked at and they said, this one will crush, and it's going to go under the parking lot because it isn't strong enough. And so some of the stones were appreciated and some were rejected. Isn't that the perfect descriptor of the human condition? Haven't you in your life felt just like the writer here of 1 Peter tells us Jesus felt, like the stone that the builders rejected? Some of us doubtless have experienced that more than others. And some of us might even think that our experience of being that stone that the builders have rejected is somehow unique, and we know it in ways that no one else does. But the reality is that it is a part of the human condition. All of us have been rejected at one point or another. And it is true that our culture and even the church rejects some people a little more often and more readily than others, but we all have experienced it. And so we come here as all kinds of stones. Some of us are large and smooth, worn that way from the buffeting of life. Some of us are small and beautiful and sparkle in the sun. But as soon as we say that, we realize that the sparkly bits are only revealed after the stone has been broken. After it's been broken. Some of us are filled with visible traces of history, the fossils of what went before us. Some of us are jagged and hard and painful to be around. Some break easily when stressed. Others seem to be able to withstand any and all forces that come their way. Some are thin and flat, others are round and large, some are dark in color, light in color, some are dull, some are shiny. Some catch our eyes because of the striking beauty, and others we would walk by without ever even noticing that they existed. But all of those stones, all of we stones, have been tossed aside at one point or another. All of us have been told, you don't fit. You don't belong here. Some of us are rejected because we're the wrong body shape. We're too thin or too heavy, too tall or too short. Somehow we don't fit the cultural definitions of beauty, and we all know what they are, don't we? We see them every day, again and again and again and again. Maybe, though, some of us even fit those definitions too well. Folk singer Ani DeFranco had a line in one of her songs. She said, "Everyone harbors a secret hatred for the prettiest girl in the room." And so even if we fit the definitions too well, we still find ourselves sometimes being pushed away because of that. Sometimes we're the wrong color. There was a recent comedian who was on Conan O'Brien's TV show, an Indian comedian, and he was saying, it's a hard time to be a brown person. But if you're brown, it's best to be Indian. We're kind of like the white people of brown people. But even that part of the brown-toned community are finding themselves oppressed in ways that they hadn't experienced before. Sometimes our clothing indicates that we're of the wrong culture. I had a tie on for Good Friday. And I came into the living room and Corwin saw me. And he said, "Jaja, are you going to be on the news?" He lives in a culture where people don't wear ties unless they're on the news. And yet, back east, not only did I wear a tie, I wore a white shirt on Sundays, never colored, white, with a suit, not a jacket and pants. And of course, there were all kinds of things said the first Sunday that I didn't wear a robe and a stole in the pulpit. Sometimes our clothing says we fit or don't fit. Sometimes our language does the same. Every now and again, I still find that I speak some of that stuff from Pittsburgh. And you probably know it. Yins do. Yins can hear it. And it'll slip out, and someone will look at me and I'll know they're thinking, "You're not from here, are you? You're not from here." Sometimes we have the wrong educational level. Maybe it's too little. Maybe it's too much. You might be one of the cultural elite. Shame on you for that one. Sometimes we're the wrong nationality. Sometimes the gender of the person whom we love is not acceptable in this particular group of people. And so we might be there with our loved one, but we're careful we're not going to touch their hand for fear of what someone will think. And it goes both ways. Once back in upstate New York, I did sound at a concert for a lesbian folk singer, wonderful musician. The entire audience were all lesbian couples. There was a couple, 2 gay men, and me, the only men in the venue. Everybody was wonderful to me. No one looked at me funny, no one did anything, but it was very clear they were telling jokes and sharing experiences, and I didn't fit. I didn't fit. Sometimes our age pushes us outside of the in-group, and we find that because we're not yet 55, we can't move into this place. And as amazing as it sounds, sometimes your gender keeps you off the Senate committee that's figuring out health care. We've all been on the outside looking in. And yes, indeed, it even happens in church, doesn't it? That sometimes We find more rejection coming from folk who claim to be representing Jesus than from anybody else in the culture. And it is still the most segregated hour in the United States. On our vacation, we went to a church that was the most integrated church in every way you can imagine that I've ever been in. And the scary thing about that was we noticed it. We noticed that there were people of all colors, that the worship team up front, there were Latinos and African Americans, there were Asian folk, and there were Anglos, and they were all there together, and we saw it and we thought, wow. And then we were ashamed, because you're not supposed to think, wow. The church has been described as the one institution in this culture that shoots its wounded. And we've all been pushed away because we've been wounded. And it doesn't matter whether we self-inflicted that wound or if someone else did it to us. So we've been excluded. Excluded. And you'll notice I never even mentioned the folk who get excluded because they're not in a couple. And if I was reading my manuscript right now, you would notice that it's not in there, because I didn't even think of that one. But it's true, isn't it? Some of us get rejected because we are not in a couple. Well, 1 Peter's audience knew that feeling of being rejected. They knew that feeling of being the stones that the builders had looked at and thrown away, just as Jesus did. And it happened for multiple reasons. Some of them were likely what were known as God-fearers. They were Gentiles who had become committed to the God of Judaism and had committed themselves to being Jewish in every way they could, but they weren't allowed to be completely part of the community, often for some ceremonial reason. Maybe it was because they were a 55-year-old man and said, you know what, I'm not getting circumcised at this point in my life. Or maybe they worked as a tanner, touching dead animals. Or maybe they had raised pigs for their entire life and they didn't know what else to do with themselves. But for whatever reason, they were kept at arm's length. Some of them were rejected because they were the outsiders of their time and place. They were the people who lived on the margins that nobody wanted to get too close to. And then, of course, there were those who knew rejection because they were Christians. Because they had decided to follow Jesus in a culture that had all kinds of bad things to say about Christians. You know, they were atheists because they didn't worship the gods. And they practiced cannibalism, where they got together and they ate the body and they drank blood. We heard that about them. And I think they were guilty of incest too. Because, you know, you'd get them all together and they were all saying, this is my sister, and this is my brother, and this is my sister. And yet this woman who's my sister, guess what? I spent last night in bed with her. And all of those ideas were going around in the broader culture, and so they said, you know what, we'll just keep them at arm's length. And so they were rejected for those reasons too. These folk knew what it felt like to be thrown away. They knew those words that 1 Peter quotes from Hosea here, what it felt like to not be a people, and certainly not to be a part of this people, whoever this people happened to be. They knew that feeling. But they had heard good news. They had heard about a God who loved them so much that Jesus put on flesh, to be one of them. They had heard about a God who, whenever someone drew a line, was always on the wrong side. And if it happened that they were on the wrong side, then that same God was standing with them. They heard good news about a God who loved them exactly as they are, whatever kind of stone they happened to be. And indeed, that one who built the entire universe chose the very stone that the builders rejected and used that as the cornerstone to build a spiritual home for God's own presence. That God took each of them from the discard pile and said, "You are my child. You are part of my community. You are a stone that I have chosen and am using to build this spiritual house. And there is a place in this wall that only you can fit." There's some great walls over at Via Verdi. They're holding up some of the embankments. And it's the coolest thing because these walls, there's these big rocks, and they're held together just by gravity. There's no mortar. And when the guy was building it was fascinating. He had this big crane thing, and he literally would pick up a rock with this crane, and he'd kind of turn it around and look at it, and he'd put it back down, and then pick one up over here, turn around and look at it, and put it on the wall. And push. And then he'd look at it for a while, and he'd look at the rocks, and he'd pick up another one, and God's doing that with us. With you and with me. That the builder sees us not as stones to be rejected and thrown away, but to be put into that unique place in God's wall that only you or I can fit. That only your experiences and your insights and your understanding of the world and your hopes and your dreams and your fears and your gifts and your lack of gifts, all of that stuff that makes you, you, and me, that makes us fit there. And so God chooses this wonderful mix of shapes and sizes, of colors and textures, of backgrounds and makeups, of dreams and visions, of possibilities, of men and women. Sure as we can be sometimes, confused other times, knowing what the path is sometimes, and other times being completely unsure of where we're headed or how to get there. Young, old, liberal, conservative, independent even. All of those things. You name whatever it is that makes us who we are, and God says, "You're mine. Just as you are. Just as you are." Now, don't get me wrong here. Sometimes those rocks need to be worked a little bit. Sometimes there are some jagged pieces that need to get knocked off. Because those jagged pieces keep us from fitting in with anybody. Sometimes we need to get broken so that the shiny bits can show. Maybe we don't even know the shiny bits are there until they've been broken. But God does use those hard times to smooth out the rough edges and to reveal what isn't yet seen. But as God puts this all together, God is building something amazing, and it is a home for the very presence of God, and that is constructed from the raw material that is you and me. And we will shine with God's presence because we will reflect all of the diversity of God's creation. You know, that same creation that God looked at and said, it's very good. Very good. And that's what God is up to here. Some of you have been rejected. Some of you might even have felt rejected at times in this very community. But not by Jesus. We may not have been a people, but we are God's own people. We may have been stones that the builders rejected. Indeed, we have all been stones that the builders rejected. But the builder has taken us and is shaping us into something beautiful and wonderful.